Does America really have a godly heritage? Did you realize that 52 of the 55 founding fathers who worked on the Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches, and many were even evangelical Christians? We don't hear that part of our history anymore. This 1856 Maryland history textbook contains a story about George Washington that you've probably never heard. It's a story of how Washington's life hung in the balance for over 2 hours and how that only by the direct intervention of God was it spared. We'll get to this story in just a moment. This story of George Washington once appeared in virtually every student text in America, but hasn't been seen in 40 years. This story deals with George Washington when he was involved in the French and Indian War as a young man of only 23 years of age. The French and Indian War occurred 20 years before the American Revolution. It was the British against the French, and the Americans sided with the British, and most of the Indians sided with the French. Both Great Britain and France disputed each other's claims of ownership along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Both of them claimed the same land. Unable to settle the dispute diplomatically, Great Britain sent 2,300 hand-picked veteran British troops to America under General Edward Braddock to rout the French. The British troops arrived in Virginia, where George Washington was colonel of the Virginia militia, and he and 100 Virginia buckskins joined General Braddock. They divided their force, and General Braddock, George Washington, and 1,300 troops marched north to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, now the city of Pittsburgh. On July the 9th, 1755, only 7 miles from the fort, while marching through a wooded ravine, they walked right into an ambush. The French and Indians opened fire on them from both sides. But these were British veterans. They knew exactly what to do. The problem was they were veterans of European wars. European warfare was all in the open. One army lined up at one end of an open field, the other army lined up at the other end. They looked at each other, they took aim, and they fired. No running, no hiding. But here they were in the Pennsylvania woods with the French and Indians firing at them from both sides, from the tops of trees and from behind rocks and from under logs. Well, when they came under fire, the British troops did exactly what they'd been taught. They lined up shoulder to shoulder in the bottom of that ravine, and they were slaughtered. At the end of 2 hours, 714 of the 1,300 British and American troops had been shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians had been shot. There were 86 British and American officers involved in that battle, and at the end of the battle, George Washington was the only officer who had not been shot down off his horse. He was the only officer left on horseback. Following this resounding defeat, Washington gathered the remaining troops and they retreated back to Fort Cumberland in western Maryland. They arrived there on July the 17th, 1755, and the next day, Washington wrote a letter to his family explaining that after the battle was over, he had taken off his jacket and had found 4 bullet holes through his jacket, yet not a single bullet had touched him. Several horses had been shot from under him, but he had not been harmed. He told them, "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I've been protected beyond all human probability or expectation." Washington openly acknowledged that God's hand was upon him, that God had protected him and kept him through that battle. However, the story does not stop here. 15 years later in 1770, now a time of peace, George Washington and a close personal friend, Dr. James Craik, returned to those same Pennsylvania woods. An old Indian chief from far away, having heard that Washington had come back to those woods, traveled a long way just to meet him. He sat down with Washington, and face to face over a council fire, the chief told Washington that he had been a leader in that battle 15 years earlier, and that he had instructed his braves to single out all the officers and shoot them down. Washington had been singled out, and the chief explained that he personally had shot at Washington 17 different times, but without effect. Believing Washington to be under the care of the Great Spirit, the chief instructed his braves to cease firing at him. He then told Washington, "I've traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." That account appeared in American history textbooks for nearly a century and a half. Today, it has disappeared. There are so many things that we no longer hear today. For example, we're now told that our founding fathers were atheists, agnostics, and deists. But consider this statement by Patrick Henry. He said, "It cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ." Now that's a strong statement, right to the point. One of the many proofs of Patrick Henry's claim is found in this book by the American Tract Society. The American Tract Society, which today still publishes gospel tracts and gospel literature for soul winning, evangelization, etc., existed in the early 1800s. In 1813, they bound their individual tracts together to make Volume 1 of the American Tract Society tracts. While it is fascinating to read these Bible tracts and the messages they contain, it's even more fascinating to note the authors of these gospel tracts. Several of the tracts were written by founding fathers who signed our founding documents. Another founder with succinct declarations about the role of Christianity in American government was John Quincy Adams. However, before examining what he said, consider education as it was at the time of the founders. The New England Primer was the first textbook ever printed in America. It was introduced in Boston in 1690, and for the next 200 years, it was the textbook of America's schools. For 2 centuries, if you went to school in America, you probably learned to read from the New England Primer. Today, we would call it a first-grade textbook or a first-grade reader, but they didn't have grade levels then, so they simply called it a primer. It began with the alphabet. It showed students how to make 1 and 2 and 3 letter syllables, and then how to put those syllables together to make words. And then later, about a fourth of the way through the book, they returned to the alphabet, and they attached a phrase to each letter of the alphabet, and the students read the phrases and memorized those phrases. Notice the phrases that comprise the alphabet of America's schools for nearly 200 years, and note that every one of these phrases is a Bible verse. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little with fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. D, do not the abominable thing which I hate, saith the Lord. E, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God, and on it goes verse after verse. This was the alphabet of America's schools for over 200 years. In the back of the book, there were several questions. Now remember, this is a first-grade reader. These are first-grade questions. What's the 5th commandment? What's forbidden in the 5th commandment? What's required in the 6th commandment? What's forbidden in the 6th commandment? And many similar questions. This was the foundation of America's schools for 200 years. John Quincy Adams went through this type of educational system, as did most of the founding fathers. And when John Quincy Adams was 14 years old, under this system of education, he received a congressional diplomatic appointment overseas to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia as secretary to an ambassador. Can you imagine sending a 14-year-old overseas today to officially represent the United States in Russia? John Quincy Adams had a lengthy and a distinguished political career. He served as foreign ambassador under Presidents George Washington and John Adams, as Secretary of State under President James Monroe. He served as a U.S. representative, a U.S. senator, and as the nation's 6th president. In a speech on July the 4th, 1837 at Newburyport, he asked the crowd, "Why is it that next to the birthday of the Savior of the world, your most joyous and most venerated festival returns on this day, on the 4th of July?" That's a very appropriate question. Why is it that the 4th of July and Christmas were our top 2 holidays in America? John Quincy Adams answered that question. Is it not that in the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior? That it forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation? Is it not that the Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission upon earth? That it laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity? And on he goes for the next 60 pages. John Quincy Adams stressed that the biggest victory won in the American Revolution was that Christian principles and civil government would be tied together in what he called an indissoluble bond. But today we hear just the opposite. Today we're told that the founders wanted separation. That's not what he said. Other significant founders were outspoken about their Christian beliefs. For example, John Jay, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and one of the 3 men most responsible for the Constitution, he declared, "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty, as well as the privilege and interest, of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." Now, how long has it been since we've heard that type of statement from the Supreme Court? But was John Jay competent to offer such a statement? Yes. He was the original Chief Justice and one of the 3 men most responsible for our having the Constitution today. And he said that we should elect Christians for our rulers. George Washington's farewell address is yet another aspect of our heritage which has disappeared from student texts. His farewell address once appeared as a separate school textbook for over a century. Students were taught that Washington's farewell address was the most significant political speech ever delivered to the nation. And why not? He's the father of the country. He spent 45 years of his life in public service, everything from commander-in-chief through 2 terms as president. He's the man who was president of the convention that gave us the Constitution. He was the president of the United States who called for the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. And he was the man who oversaw its formation. Certainly, he knew the intent of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In his farewell address, he reminded America what had brought us to success and warned us what must be done to continue it. Yet amazingly, his farewell address has not been seen in most textbooks for nearly 4 decades. Why? Doesn't Washington have anything to offer the nation today? No, apparently the problem with his farewell address today is its religious emphasis. For 4 of his dozen or so warnings to the nation were overtly religious. It is interesting to note that in the last 5 years, his farewell address has begun to reappear in college textbooks, minus those 4 religious warnings. In his farewell address, Washington pointed out that the 2 foundations for political prosperity in America were religion and morality, and that no one could be called an American patriot who ever attempted to separate politics from its 2 foundations. Washington explained, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Washington believed that if an individual attempted to separate religion and morality from politics, that he could not be called an American patriot. These type of statements we do not hear much anymore, but such were the statements of America's founders, the statements of America's history. Our founding fathers delivered to us a system of government which has enjoyed unprecedented success. We are now the world's longest ongoing constitutional republic, 200 years under the same document and under one form of government. That's an accomplishment unknown among contemporary nations. For example, Russia, Italy, France, and other nations underwent revolutions at about the same time as the American Revolution, but with very different results. Consider France. In the last 200 years, it has gone through 7 completely different forms of government. Italy is now in its 51st, yet we're still in our first. Where then did our founders acquire the ideas that produced such longevity? Other nations certainly had access to what our founders utilized, yet evidently chose not to. From what sources did our founders choose their ideas? This question was asked by political science professors at the University of Houston. They felt, and rightfully so, that they could determine the source of the founders' ideas if they could collect writings from the founding era and see whom the founders were quoting. The researchers assembled 15,000 writings from the founding era, no small sample, and searched those writings. That project spanned 10 years, but at the end of that time, the researchers had isolated 3,154 direct quotes made by the founders and had identified the source of those quotes. The researchers discovered that Baron Charles Montesquieu was the man quoted most often by the founding fathers, with 8.3% of the founders' quotes being taken from his writings. Sir William Blackstone was the second most quoted individual, with 7.9% of the founders' quotes, and John Locke was third with 2.9%. Surprisingly, the researchers discovered that the founders quoted directly out of the Bible 4 times more often than they quoted Montesquieu, 4 times more often than they quoted Blackstone, and 12 times more often than they quoted John Locke. 34% of the founders' quotes came directly out of the Bible. The study was even more impressive when the source of the ideas used by Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke were identified. Consider, for example, the source of Blackstone's ideas. Blackstone's commentaries on the laws were first introduced in 1768, and for the next 160 years they served as the law textbook of America. America's courts quoted Blackstone to settle disputes, to define words, to examine procedure. Blackstone's was the final word in the Supreme Court. So what was the significant source of Blackstone's ideas? Perhaps the best answer to that question can be given through the life of Charles Finney. Charles Finney is known as a famous revivalist, minister, and preacher from one of America's greatest revivals, the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. Finney, in his autobiography, spoke of how he received his call to the ministry. He explained that having determined to become a lawyer, he, like all other law students at the time, commenced the study of Blackstone's commentaries on law. Finney noted that Blackstone's commentaries not only provided the laws, it also provided the biblical concepts on which those laws were based. Finney explained that in the process of studying Blackstone's commentaries, he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian and received his call to the ministry. Finney's personal life story clearly identifies a major source of Blackstone's ideas for law. So while 34% of the founders' quotes came directly out of the Bible, another 60% of their quotes were taken from men, like Blackstone, who had used the Bible to arrive at their own conclusions. 94% of the founders' quotes were either based directly or indirectly on the Bible. Numerous components of our current government can be shown through these early writings to have their source in biblical concepts. For example, the concept for the three branches of government can be found in Isaiah 33:22. The logic for the separation of powers was based on Jeremiah 17:9. The basis of tax exemptions for churches was found in Ezra 7:24, and many other examples. It is interesting to read in the early congressional records about congressmen coming onto the floor of the House or the Senate and presenting something they had found in the Bible. It would be discussed, voted on, and then become the basis of government policy. This type of heritage is well documented in the official writings, but today we no longer hear about it. This biblical heritage was so well understood during the early years of the nation, and the writings of the numerous founding fathers were so well known, that in later years the Supreme Court ruled in the founders' intention, keeping biblical principles as the basis. For example, notice this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892. The court said, "Our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind." This is a strong statement, but the court continued, "It is impossible that it should be otherwise, and in this sense and to this extent, our civilizations and our institutions are emphatically Christian." What would lead the court to conclude that the teachings of Christ must be included in our laws and institutions, that we are, as they said, emphatically a Christian nation? This case was not long, only 16 pages in the court records, but the court provided 87 different historical precedents to support its conclusions. The court quoted the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Congresses, the acts of the state governments, and so on. At the end of 87 precedents, the court explained that it could continue to cite many additional precedents, but that certainly 87 were sufficient to conclude that our laws and our institutions must be based on and must include the teachings of Christ. Keep in mind that the court provided 87 precedents in this case. This is important because the courts based their decision on precedents. To the court, it is important to go back and examine both history and rulings from previous cases so that the court can continue to be consistent in its present rulings. We'll return to the importance of precedents a little later. In 1844, a school in Philadelphia announced that it would teach its students morality, but not religion. It believed that it didn't need Christianity in the Bible, that it could teach morality without them. Sounds just like schools today. This policy, among others, caused this case to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. Some of the justices on the court at this time had been appointed by James Madison. Notice what the Supreme Court told that school. "Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools, its general precepts expounded and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?" The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that schools would teach Christianity in the Bible, the source of morality. Today we hear just the opposite. Few realize that today's rulings by the court often repudiate rulings delivered by the Founding Fathers themselves. In 1811, a court made a ruling which was subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. That court declared, "Whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government." Although this case dealt with a man who went into a profanity fit, profanity wasn't the problem. It was the intent of his profanity. For it had not been a moment of anger or a temporary loss of control, but it was a deliberate and a planned act. He had even taken the time to write it out and distribute it. In that writing, he had maliciously and capriciously attacked Jesus Christ, declaring that Jesus Christ is so-and-so, or God is so-and-so, or the Bible is such and such, continuing through a string of accusations and profanities against Jesus Christ and the Word of God. The court explained that the problem with his writings was that an attack on Jesus Christ was an attack on Christianity. An attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of the country. Therefore, an attack on Jesus Christ was equivalent to an attack on the country. This man was sentenced to 3 months in prison and a $500 fine for attacking the country by attacking Jesus. And notice the date of that case, 1811, nearly 2 decades after the First Amendment was in place. The First Amendment never intended to separate Christian principles from government. Yet today we so often hear the First Amendment coupled with the phrase, separation of church and state. The First Amendment simply states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Obviously, the words separation, church, or state are not found in the First Amendment. Furthermore, that phrase appears in no founding document. While most recognize the phrase separation of church and state, few know its source. But it is important to understand the origins of that phrase. What is the history of the First Amendment? The process of drafting the First Amendment made the intent of the founders abundantly clear. For before they approved the final wording, the First Amendment went through nearly a dozen different iterations and extensive discussions. Those discussions, recorded in the U.S. congressional records from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, make clear their intent for the First Amendment. By it, the founders were saying, we do not want in America what we had in Great Britain. We don't want one denomination running the nation. We will not allow all to be Catholics or Anglicans or any other single denomination. We do want God's principles, but we don't want one denomination running the nation. This intent was well understood, as evidenced by court rulings after the First Amendment. For example, a 1799 court declared, by our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion, and all sects and denominations of Christians are placed on the same equal footing. Again, note the emphasis. We do want Christian principles, we do want God's principles, but we don't want one denomination to run the nation. In 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut heard a rumor that the Congregationalist denomination was about to be made the national denomination. That rumor distressed the Danbury Baptists, as it should have. Consequently, they fired off a letter to President Thomas Jefferson voicing their concern. On January the 1st, 1802, Jefferson wrote the Danbury Baptists, assuring them that, quote, the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state. His letter explained that they need not fear the establishment of a national denomination, and that while the wall of the First Amendment would protect the church from government control, that there always would be open and free religious expression of all orthodox religious practices, for true religious duties never threaten the purpose of government. The government would interfere with the religious activity only if that activity was a direct menace to the government or to the overall peace and good order of society. Later Supreme Courts identified potential religious activities in which the government might interfere. Things like human sacrifice, bigamy or polygamy, the advocation of immorality or licentiousness, and so on. If any of these activities were to occur in the name of religion, then the government would interfere, for these were activities which threatened public peace and safety. But with orthodox religious practices, the government would not interfere. Today, all that is heard of Jefferson's letter is the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, without either the context or the explanation given in the letter or its application by earlier courts. The clear understanding of the First Amendment for a century and a half was that it prohibited the establishment of a single denomination. National policies and rulings in that century and a half always reflected that interpretation. For example, in 1853, a group petitioned Congress to separate Christian principles from government. They desired a so-called separation of church and state, with chaplains being turned out of Congress, out of the military, etc. Their petition was referred to the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees, which investigated for almost a year to see if it would be possible to separate Christian principles from government. Both the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees returned with the reports. The following are excerpts from the House report delivered on March the 27th, 1854. The Senate report was very similar. The House report said, had the people, the Founding Fathers, during the Revolution had any suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one sect, denomination. The report continued. It said, in this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. 2 months later, the Judiciary Committee made this strong declaration. It said, the great, vital, and conservative element in our system, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and the divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The committees explained that they would not separate these principles, for it was these principles and activities which had made us so successful. They had been our foundation, our basis. During the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, yet another group which challenged specific Christian principles in government arrived before the Supreme Court. Now, Jefferson's letter had remained unused for years. For as time had progressed after its use in 1802, and after no national denomination had been established, his letter had fallen into obscurity. But now, 75 years later, in the case Reynolds versus the United States, the plaintiffs resurrected Jefferson's letter, hoping to use it as an issue to their advantage. At that time, the court printed a lengthy segment of Jefferson's letter and then used that letter on separation of church and state to again prove that it was permissible to maintain Christian values, principles, and practices in official policy. For the next 15 years during that legal controversy, the Supreme Court utilized Jefferson's letter to ensure that Christian principles remained a part of government. Following this controversy, Jefferson's letter again fell into disuse. It remained silent for the next 70 years until 1947, when in the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court, for the first time, did not cite Jefferson's entire letter, but selected only 8 words from it. The court now announced, "The First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable." This was a new philosophy for the court. Why would the court take Jefferson's letter completely out of context and cite only 8 of its words? Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology and a strong opponent of religious principles in government and education, perhaps explained the court's new strategy when he stated, "There is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it." This statement precisely describes the tact utilized by the court in the years following its 1947 announcement. The court began regularly to speak of a separation of church and state, broadly explaining that this is what the founders wanted, separation of church and state. This is their great intent. The court failed to quote the founders. It just generically asserted that this is what the founders wanted. The courts continued on this track so steadily that in 1958, in a case called Bear versus Colmorgan, one of the judges was tired of hearing the phrase, and he wrote a dissent warning that if this court did not stop talking about separation of church and state, people were going to start thinking it was part of the Constitution. That warning was in 1958. Nevertheless, the court continued to talk about separation until June the 25th, 1962, when in the case Engel versus Vitale, the court delivered its first ever ruling which completely separated Christian principles from education. The court struck down school prayer. Even the World Book Encyclopedia 1963 yearbook noted that this case was the first time that there had been a separation of church and state in education. In the 1962 case, the court redefined the meaning and application of a single word, the word church. For 170 years prior to that case, the word church, as used in the phrase separation from church and state, was defined to mean a federally established denomination. However, in 1962, the court explained that the word church would now mean a religious activity in public. This was the turning point in the interpretation of the First Amendment. Understand what the court has just announced. No longer would the First Amendment simply prohibit the establishment of a federal denomination, it would now prohibit religious activities in public settings. This current doctrine of separation is a brand new doctrine. It is not something from the Founding Fathers, and it is not in any founding document. Even outside observers recognize that this policy is a recent one. Yet notice how much has been relinquished in recent years under this new doctrine. School prayer was the first casualty of the redefinition of the First Amendment in the 1962 Engel case. School prayer had never before been challenged, for clearly school prayer had never established a national denomination and therefore had always been acceptable. But under the new definition, school prayer definitely was a religious activity in public and was therefore now deemed to be unconstitutional. That 1962 case, which first redefined the First Amendment and then removed school prayer, was notable in a number of aspects. Recall that the 1892 Supreme Court case offered 87 precedents to maintain the inclusion of Christian principles in our laws and our institutions. Well, this 1962 case, which removed school prayer, was just the opposite. It was the first case in court history to use 0 precedents. The court quoted 0 previous legal cases, and without any historical or legal base, the court simply made an announcement. We'll not have prayers in school anymore. That violates the Constitution. A brand new direction was taken in America. Within a 12-month period of time, in 2 more cases in 1963, the court had not only removed prayer, but also Bible reading, religious classes, and religious instruction. This was a radical reversal. A book from 1946 illustrates this. This book is titled Bible Study Course of the New Testament for Dallas High Schools. On the cover page, it explains that this book was authorized by the Board of Education on April 23, 1946, and it was printed in the Dallas Public Schools print shop. The introduction further explains that this was a credit course toward graduation in Dallas high schools. And this wasn't a bland course on the New Testament. Lesson 1 begins with the Gospel of John, chapter 1, and studies the pre-existence of Christ. Now notice the questions based on John chapter 1. Where was Christ before he was born on earth? What titles does John apply to Christ in this chapter? For what purpose was John sent by God? Name 5 things the angel told Mary concerning her child Jesus. What does the word Jesus mean? How did the angel explain the miraculous births of John and Jesus? And continues right on through the lesson. At the end of lesson 1 is memory work. Memorize the pre-existence of Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. This was a textbook for public schools in 1946. What had occurred in the 1962 and 63 rulings was a radical reversal of national policy prior to that point. It was in the Abingdon v. Schempp and Murray v. Curlett decisions on June the 17th, 1963, that the court not only reaffirmed its ban on school prayer from the previous year, but further reached out and banned school Bible reading. Recall that in the brief survey already presented, 94% of the quotes of the Founding Fathers were based either directly or indirectly on the Bible. Early textbooks quoted the Bible and used it as part of the alphabet, and earlier Supreme Courts ruled that a school must teach religion and the Bible. Therefore, on what possible basis can the 1963 court justify its ruling to stop the use of the Bible in schools? The court always explains its decision in written form. That 1963 case was no different. If you go to a law library and examine the text of that decision, you will find why the Bible had to be removed from school. In its written decision, the court noted that, quote, if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. Now that's quite a statement. The court has determined that the Bible has to come out of schools because it causes psychological damage to children. For the second time in a year, this was a case lacking both historical and legal precedent. Again, the court simply made a new announcement of policy: no more Bible reading in schools. Bible reading causes brain damage to students. The courts continued to extend the new boundary outward. In 1965, in the case Reed v. Van Hoven, the court determined that it was possible for students to pray over their lunch at school so long as no one knew they were praying. They couldn't say words or move their lips, but they could pray if no one knew about it. In 1967, in DeKalb v. Despain, the court took a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class and declared that nursery rhyme unconstitutional. The court explained that although the word God was not contained in this nursery rhyme, if someone were to hear the rhyme, they might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend continued in case after case, year after year. In 1 year alone, 3 cases made the courts challenging the right of students to see copies of the Ten Commandments while at school. The Supreme Court accepted the Stone v. Graham case from Kentucky, where a copy of the Ten Commandments was hanging in the hallways of the schools. The court acknowledged that the Ten Commandments were passive displays. That is, they simply hung on the walls just like a picture of George Washington. They were not part of any class or any curriculum. They just hung there. A student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, fine. Yet notice the court's ruling under the redefined First Amendment. The court said, if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible objective. That's quite a statement. You can't let kids see the Ten Commandments, because if they do, they might obey them. Things like don't steal, don't kill, and that would be unconstitutional. When the court declares something unconstitutional, it is inferring that our Founding Fathers, the men who drafted the Constitution, would have opposed it. However, notice what James Madison, the chief architect of the Constitution, said about the Ten Commandments. He said, we have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We've staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God. That which the chief architect of the Constitution considered to be the most crucial aspect of American constitutional government, the current court has declared to be unconstitutional. The entire controversy over God and religious activities and teachings in school had begun with the 22-word prayer in the Engel Vital case. That 22-word prayer, the prayer that led to the removal of all prayers from America's schools, simply said, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even contain the word Jesus, was a bland prayer. It was so bland that 8 years later,